to be clear, you are
I'll
convinced that President Putin is going to invade Ukraine. Is that what you just said a few moments ago?
Yes, I did. Yes.
So is diplomacy off the table then?
No, until he does, diplomacy is always a possibility.
What reason do you have to believe he's considering that option at all?
We have a significant intelligence capability. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
ракеты. Сход первого изделия, замечания есть.
I think it's pretty clear that Putin and Russia have a desire to reestablish Russia as a world power, and also along with that goes the ambition by Putin to regain control over what they would look at as their near abroad, meaning those places around the periphery of Russia that at least at one point were either part of the USSR or part of the Warsaw Pact. And to readjust or to recalibrate the post-Cold War architecture, if you will, of Europe. Now, we've heard Putin say on more than one occasion that the worst catastrophe of his life was the collapse of the Soviet Union back in 1991. And I think at this point, Putin, as well as every other rogue on earth, I mean, we could be talking about Xi Jinping, you know, in China, or Kim Jong-un in North Korea, or, you know, the Ayatollahs in Tehran in the same way. But they see a window of opportunity now because their perception of the United States right now is one of weakness. That the Biden administration in the White House is just not up to, well, much of anything. Quite a difference, quite a turnaround from the time of the previous president, Donald Trump, and his 4-year tenure, when there was an understanding, there was a respect, if not even a fear of United States and what Trump would do, could do, might do. And so in this window of opportunity, certainly before we get to the United States midterm congressional elections of this coming November 2022, when it's expected that Republicans will retake the House of Representatives, possibly the Senate as well, and at least reinstate some kind of serious leadership to the United States and put a break on some of the policies of the Biden administration. So the window is between now, we're here in February of 2022, and November, or well, let's say when they take office, January of 2023. So rogues are us of the world, and Putin is certainly one of the leading members of that club. See this opportunity and wanting to grab back as much influence and power over its near abroad as possible. Putin has his sights set on Eastern Europe and certainly on Ukraine. Now, it must be said that after the Cold War, NATO expanded rather aggressively, probably too aggressively, in my opinion, eastward, adding new members sort of willy-nilly without any real thought as to the capability of NATO to defend those new state members. And these would include places like Poland and Slovakia and Romania and Bulgaria, arrayed around the borders of Ukraine, for example. The Baltics would like to be free of Russian influence. But can NATO actually defend these places? Now, Ukraine is not a member of NATO and has no chance, no possibility of becoming a member of NATO anytime soon, because it simply doesn't meet the criteria and has no hope of meeting those criteria, probably in our lifetimes. But Putin and Russia fear that Ukraine could become a member of NATO, or maybe that's just their excuse for the aggression and the belligerence. And in that framework, setting that up as our framework, Putin moved on Crimea, of course, back in 2014. Now, of course, Crimea always had been a part of Russia since Catherine the Great freed it from the jihadi Ottoman Turks. So Crimea belonged to Russia in the sense that its people wanted to be part of Russia, had been part of Russia. And of course, Sevastopol was the warm water port for the Russian Navy, and they weren't about to give that up. This should have been foreseen, but it wasn't. And there wasn't much of a squawk during the Obama administration when Putin reincorporated Crimea into Russia. So now he's got his sights set on more parts of Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, called the Donbass, where there are two regions, Donetsk and Luhansk. And I would add another region, and I think it is likely that Putin would like to carve off a slice, if you can picture the geography of Ukraine, that would connect Crimea to Russia, which it is not geographically connected by land right now, along the Sea of Azov. So this is just setting the scene for us, but this is what Putin wants. He fears that NATO would make Ukraine a member at some point, allowing it, if Ukraine were willing, allowing NATO to position nuclear weapons on its territory 5 minutes flying distance from Moscow. Now we'll remember that our president, John F. Kennedy, went to the brink of nuclear war back in 1962 to get Russian, then Soviet, nuclear weapons off of Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Now, that may be just Putin's excuse for making a move on a territory that he and Russia have long considered integral parts of Russia, going back to the foundation of Kievan Rus centuries ago. Nevertheless, Ukraine is an independent country. It's a very imperfect, but moving towards a democratic form of government. And according to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, the United States, Britain, Russia, and Ukraine all agreed that Ukraine's sovereign borders, sovereign territory must be respected. Now, that was not a defense treaty. It was something like a memorandum of understanding. Does not bind any of us to defend Ukraine. But nevertheless, there was an understanding that its territorial integrity would be respected. Of course, it is not. So let me stop there because that's just setting the scene, and we can go from there.
Okay, I appreciate that, Claire. I want to say something. It almost sounds like you're saying, and others have said, that Putin is still of the old Soviet mentality, believing that the United States was actually at some point going to launch a first strike against the Soviet Union, now Russia. He was very entrenched. He still holds a very Soviet era mentality. Do you think he really believes that the United States is going to launch a first strike against what's now Russia, just like they thought it was going to be when it was the Soviet Union?
No, he doesn't believe that. He knows that we're not going to do that. But I would cast Putin more in the mold of Russian emperors, Russian Tsars of old. He's not just a KGB Soviet apparatchik, which he is, but he's very much in the mold of the Tsarist emperors of centuries past, thinking about Russia in an expansive form, that it should be a world power, it should be powerful, extend its influence over all of the near abroad, and that anything that ever was part of that empire should forever and again be part of that empire. That's how he thinks.
Which is pretty much how some of the early profiles pictured him. Colonel, what is your take? Is it pretty much the same as Claire's, that that Putin is actually going to do something like this, or maybe he's trying to back us into a corner? Biden said at the press conference maybe 2 hours ago, hour and a half ago, that he was convinced. He just outright said when he was asked the question, "Are you saying that you believe Putin's going to invade Ukraine?" And Biden said, "Absolutely." He didn't mince any words about it. Somebody's going to pay a terrible cost for this if this happens. And if it does, can this thing escalate from a conventional war to something else? Colonel?
Yes, anything can escalate. I think in this capacity, the U.S. really has kind of put Putin where he is currently as it stands. I know that Article 5 of NATO, you hear a lot of the pundits talk about, is means that, attack against one of the NATO countries is an attack against all NATO countries. But there's also Article 10, and Article 10 specifically puts burden on the United States. That means that if there's a nation in Europe, when it comes to part of the North Atlantic Treaty, that wants to join NATO, it has to initially go through the U.S. for that to take place. So the U.S. will be the one who will make that decision. Now, if we go back all the way to when Obama was in charge, as Crimea was taken, the only thing we saw in reference to Ukraine under the previous administrations, Obama, previous one, President Trump, and the current one, President Biden, was really looking at the oil sector as far as Ukraine's economy is concerned. There wasn't much thought kind of given then as to does Ukraine have the capacity and the capability to become a member of NATO? And if it was, then a lot of steps would have taken. I know that the previous POTUS tried to strengthen NATO um, in order for them to understand that they have to pay their share rather than just having the European Union countries separately striking deals, especially with Russia, which has allowed them to get to where they are. But when we kind of let go of our leadership position under the Article 10 of the agreement, to where U.S. Literally would be the lead in these processes, and you can see it even now, where you have the French leadership taking the lead in negotiations, Germany having their own discussions privately with Russia when it comes to what type of a deal they're trying to strike for the benefit of their nation. I think the issue becomes that over the next 6 months, when post-mortem has sat in on this particular process, whether Putin goes in or not, and it's more likely that now is showing that he might be going in with force structures to take over at least the Donbass area. We might see, and we might be able to at least look at what type of deals various different nations and the NATO alliance broke with Putin. Take a look at the fact that he has $200 billion in his coffers, and part of that was we kind of gave it to him indirectly with green lighting the pipeline, allowing ability for those European nations to strike deals, which now Putin has almost 200 billion at least in his hands, not just counting the oil that he was able to sent to Europe, and also the price of oil went up because we also cut our own production here in the United States. I think one thing Putin is looking at in the short term, from my perspective, and as I always say, on my show, New Paradigms, we kind of look at it from a different perspective, is that not only did he understand that he was being squeezed as you had the various different nations jockeying to take over the old Warsaw Pact nations and bring them into their fold, Ukraine on the ground, being no more than 500 plus kilometers from the Russian capital. He also realized that he was being squeezed from the east by China. As much as Putin is part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, he has deals with President Xi. He understands that once China is able to exert its capability over Europe and also over the United States, Russia is done. I think the steps he took, as much as he indirectly strengthened, maybe at least on the face of it all, that NATO is not united, working together, having a similar stand. U.S. has taken a little bit of a leadership position, maybe to try to counter what he's going to do in Ukraine. It has allowed him to use NATO to his advantage to buffer against a long-term strategic adversary who's going to be for him is that's going to be the Chinese Communist Party. He has taken this opportunity to also get into the Southern Caucasus. If the Southern Caucasus just remains silent as Chinese Communist Party expanded its Belt and Road Initiative, it would be a loss for Russia in the long run. But with him being able to force his way into the Nagorno-Karabakh region and establish himself there, also be able to establish his force structures in the various different Southern Caucasus with the issues of the coup that recently took place. It has given him an opportunity to really squeeze the Southern Caucasus into his fold again. Because if they just remain silent, as I said, he would have lost in the long term against China. Does Russia and China, do they work together? Of course. But in the long run, again, Russia knows that one day China will turn its gaze against Russia once it has been strong enough, not just in Southwest, Southeast Asia, but also at the same time in Central America and with influence politically in the United States and economically in the EU. And this may be a means and ways by which he kind of resets the chessboard, as Claire was saying, to take it back to what was prior to the Cold War. I think the Russians have a much better understanding of the American psyche than the Chinese do, because they have lived and fought in the Cold War against the United States longer. Their people have lived here. Their spies have done a much better job of collecting intel on us. And at least in that capacity, I think he understands American mentality and how our systems work possibly better than the CCP does. So this might be an overall reset for him, not just in the short term to be able to strengthen Russia and counter against possibly NATO with striking deals with the European Union on an economic basis, but also in the long term, where he would need to be able to counter against the Chinese Communist Party expansion into his territories using others to include economic means and ways. If you noticed recently, when the Iranian leadership Ayatollah went to Russia because they basically sold Iran to the tune of $400 billion to the Chinese, the Iranian leadership was not treated well in Russia. And part of that was because of the fact that he needed Iran to also counter the Chinese Communist Party and the United States in the Middle East. And he feels that they had betrayed him by literally selling themselves to the Chinese Communist Party. So let's see what happens. But unfortunately, it seems that we are pushing him to go to war more than he may have wanted to go to war.
That certainly seems to be the case. I've kind of felt that for quite some time. And I think Biden, when he said what he did today, almost put himself in a corner. But I think they're both in a corner. You know, Putin's got to save face somewhere, somehow, through all of this. It's not going to be pretty if it is a conventional ground war, which obviously it's going to have to be. Claire, would it be fought in a textbook style, like NATO and the United States are prepared for during the Cold War?
This hasn't got really anything to do with NATO or the West or the United States, truly. This is about Ukraine, and Putin has already achieved a number of objectives, even without setting one foot further inside of Ukraine so far. Number one, he has shown up the fissures within NATO itself, in particular Germany. Number two, he has demonstrated to the oligarchs, the corrupt ruler leadership of Ukraine, that neither the United States nor Europe nor NATO is going to come to their defense. And number three, he has inserted himself onto the world stage with daily coverage for the last how many weeks and perhaps months. He is the go-to guy. There's been a parade of European leadership, from Emmanuel Macron of France to Olaf Scholz of Germany, Stoltenberg of NATO, and yes, the United States, I gather, sent our border expert, Vice President Kamala Harris, to speak on the subject as well over there in Europe. So Putin has already achieved a lot of the objectives that he initially wanted. He has also gotten the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, to essentially offer that Ukraine will not be a member of NATO anytime soon, without closing the door on NATO's prerogative to invite or any country to apply. Zelensky has basically told Putin, no NATO, Ukraine, not NATO anytime soon. So Putin has already achieved a number of key objectives. And Sarge just mentioned another very important one, and that is since the Biden administration came into office over a year ago now, the Biden administration, it has kneecapped American energy independence and handed that on a platter back
Mhm.
to the OPEC members, to include Russia. And the first thing that we should have done is to continue President Trump's policy of energy independence, which kept oil prices low. Russia's break-even point for oil is $80 a barrel. Well, it is now barreling towards $100 a barrel. Thank you, President Biden. So, in addition to that, Biden allowed the completion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which, as you in the audience probably know, runs under the Baltic Sea from Russia with its terminal in northern Germany, thereby bypassing not just Ukraine, but the rest of Eastern Europe. Although other pipelines go back and forth, oil and natural gas. But the point being here, that as long as President Trump was in the White House and Ambassador Rick Grinnell was in Berlin, that pipeline, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, was not finished. It is now. And the sanctions that could have, should have, ought to have been placed on its company, the Nord Stream 2 AG, headquarters in Switzerland, not. Now, President Biden does get up in front of the teleprompter every now and then to threaten the worst sanctions that the world has ever seen. If you take one more step, Vladimir Putin, just one more step, just one more step. You know, how credible is that when he hasn't done anything in terms of credible deterrence since he's been in office? That being President Biden has not. So what we're faced with today is Ukraine surrounded on three sides, from the north in Belarus to the east, Russia, and around the south, naval units in the Black Sea, Russia as well. With the numbers change, but you know, somewhere between 150,000, 190,000 troops arrayed around that border, along with the armored personnel carriers, tanks, artillery, and other weaponry. The other thing on standby, of course, are planes, including fighter jets out of Belarus, of course, out of Russia too, and the naval units in the Black Sea. So everything's positioned with the power that Putin would need to mount a full-on invasion, which we would expect would begin with a blackout of communications, the cyber attacks that would take out communications in that way, and then perhaps aerial bombardment, missiles and planes as well, were he to make that decision. Now, President Biden, of course, today got up in front of the teleprompter again and said, it's coming, it's coming. It wasn't Wednesday, it wasn't Thursday, it wasn't Friday, but it's coming. So one of these days to come in the next week or so. At least that's what the teleprompter said. So, you know, we shall see if Putin is just leveraging the power that he has amassed against Ukraine to obtain even more concessions out of the United States and NATO and Ukraine, or whether he really intends to go all in. Now, one last note here for this bit here is that the weather in that part of the world is warming up. That's, I guess, air quotes, because what we're talking about is the high 30s Fahrenheit temperatures. But what that means is that the ground is not frozen solid anymore, making it very difficult for tracked vehicles like armored personnel carriers or tanks to maneuver in the mud that will soon cover a lot of that ground for a land invasion. But if it were to be a cyber attack, combined with an aerial assault, combined with internal destabilization within Ukraine and within the top leadership of Ukraine, that could be another way. We've seen today provocations by the Russians. A couple of oil pipelines were blown up in the Donbass. Ukraine is so far keeping its powder dry. We shall see.
Yeah. We've had plenty of surveillance aircraft in the skies. It's a black hole up there right now. If Putin is, well, let me ask you this. Do you think that he's getting any blowback or any pressure put on him by any of the old hardliners who may still be in the military, the Russian
You
military?
mean inside of Russia?
Yes.
Oh, right. Well, so, we of the West, we tend to look at places like Russia and China as, monolithically solid. It's certainly not true in China. We can talk about that another time, but in terms of Russia, neither is it monolithically solid. And a number of analysts, to include one named Andrei Ilarionov, who formerly was a very close associate of Putin, came to the Cato Institute in the United States in 2006, and since last year, 2021, has been a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy. He has written and analyzed and opined on this subject, and points out a number of weaknesses that face Putin and the Kremlin. And those include the fact that neither diplomatically, nor economically, nor militarily is Moscow really, really ready and equipped for not just a full-on land invasion of Ukraine, but the protracted, vicious fighting that would ensue. Every man and boy from 15 to 60 in Ukraine would be under arms, and probably a lot of the women too, as well as its own formal military forces, which, along with reservists and everybody they could call up, would be about 250,000. Not called up right now, but could be. They would face that. They would face that in a very flat country that's going to turn to mud pretty soon. Just the weather. And they would also be sending tens of thousands of body bags back home, which would not do well for Putin and his domestic support.
No, it wouldn't.
Economically, they cannot afford this. A protracted, long engagement, a guerrilla war, essentially, in Ukraine. They can't afford it economically. So Ilarionov makes all of these points. Jack Keene's Institute for the Study of War made a number of the same points earlier, although today I've heard him, General retired Jack Keene, more thinking that an invasion could be imminent, although I don't think even he is still thinking about a land invasion so much as what I said before, the cyber combined with the aerial bombardment assault. So there are pros and cons to what Putin can do, might do, and he has vulnerabilities. I mean, the first thing we ought to be doing right now is sanctioning all of the Russian banks, never mind SWIFT, but the Russian banks, sanctioning the pipeline, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and opening our own spigots back up immediately, full throttle, as fast as we possibly can, to drop the price of oil back down again.
You raise a very good point, and Colonel, jump in. Why, if they're so concerned that it's inevitable that he's going to pull the trigger, why, based on intelligence, they say, why hasn't the administration gone through with sanctions like that to put even more pressure on him, the oligarchs, his surrounders, everyone who has money in the bank, to try to fend this off, rather than letting this thing drag on and on to the point where we're at right now? Am I missing something here, Colonel?
You're not missing anything here, Tony. I think Claire pretty much laid everything out. You don't need to be a political scientist to understand simple stuff. I'm a very simple person. When I looked at when we initially, United States went into Iraq, Iraq was somewhere around 26 million people. The entire planet was supporting us at that time. It was completely at odds from the Kurds fighting against the Sunni Arabs fighting against the Shia and all other groupings in the middle, and we couldn't control that thing. Now you're looking at I believe it's a 42 million plus capacity of populace in Ukraine, and they're pretty much united. So for a full invasion to go in, to be able to control that area, given the fact that he's going to have the entire planet, in this case, not supporting him like they supported us in 2003, but against them, it makes no sense from a multi standpoint. Now, I'm guarantee you that his officers have told him that, sir, if you go in, there's going to be a disaster for us. Look at what happened in Afghanistan and how Afghanistan defeated us, literally dried up our coffers to put us in a position where we ended up where we are today. I think that he has been able to leverage people. One thing that Putin understands is the people's characters, and he looks at this administration not as an administration that is tied to the previous one and tied to the previous one, but he's looking at it as an administration that is only worried about the midterms, an administration that has pretty much not been able to address the issues internally in the country itself. He knows that they're not serious about supporting Ukraine. Look, as soon as multi-force structures started appearing on the border over Ukraine, if I was a president, I would have already dropped heavy brigades right into Ukraine and said, okay, let's go. It's up to you. They're part of us. Even now, if you hear the language, as has been mentioned, where the current POTUS has pretty much given the green light by saying, well, a minor incursion, they're taking that back. Once you say it, you can't really take back because you're telling them you're free game and saying that we're only there for the defense of the NATO nations, meaning that Ukraine is not part of a NATO nation. Technically, if the U.S. wanted to, they could easily, because under the Article 10 of the agreement, we could already have told all our NATO partners, guess what? The second those tanks start rolling, Ukraine's going to be part of the NATO membership. It's just a treaty, as long as you agree upon it. As they're landing in Kiev, you could make it a NATO nation, and then now it's game on. The entire force capacity of all the NATO nations can be unleashed against Putin, and then his military would be absolutely destroyed, devastated, to a point where he will not be able to recover for decades. However, with that said, you have to kind of look at what agreements are being struck. I'll take the example of the German chancellor. The German chancellor, a lot of people may not know his history. He was part of a Marxist socialist group when he was just initially starting his political career. He has made statements against NATO while he was studying, beginning his political efforts, and he was not a fan of NATO, and he was never a fan of capitalism. Germany, once the fighting took place in the Middle East with the collapse of Syria and a civil war under the previous chancellor. They took in a lot of Syrian refugees and hoping that once everything settles and Syria maybe starts rebuilding, that those same Syrian refugees that are now doing the low skilled labors and starting to get through their universities, becoming members of the German populace, will go back and start rebuilding. Well, who owns Syria right now? It's really under the strength and control, whether we like it or not, of the Russians. With the influence of the SCO, Iranians having a footprint there to support, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization led by China having a lot of money invested in a long-term build, where now you have Germany, a chancellor who was elected, but he was elected with his socialist views, being in a position where he's not only just dependent on the oil that comes from Russia, he knows that his future and his country's future is really relying on him being able to operate in nations that are going to be under the Russian sphere and control. And I think he understands those things, in this case, Putin, and he knows that in the long run, he has won by just taking the simplest steps without firing any major weapon system against the Ukrainian military. Is there going to be a war? Nobody knows. But if there is, as Claire laid it out, I think it's going to be a incursion that will not be as costly for the Russians, possibly, if they play it right, as most of us believe. And I think he knows that even in this showcase, maybe some blood has to be shed. Unfortunately, it's going to be the Ukrainian blood and those Russian soldiers who are going to be killed in order for Putin to be able to make a long term statement that Russia's back, we're in charge, we're in Syria, we're influential amongst the nation polities, and we are going to be the ones that are going to be the ones that the United States would need in the future if you're going to counter against the Chinese Communist Party. U.S. cannot beat the CCP by itself. Russia cannot beat the CCP by itself. Russia and U.S. have to work together to do that. Maybe this so-called strengthening of NATO indirectly, being in position, even if it is adversarial, at least resets the chessboard, hopefully for us. Unfortunately, the Iranians are watching, the Chinese are watching, and I'm not sure if it's going to be to benefit of the United States over the next decade if he is successful here.
Interesting. Interesting. Now, which raises a question for me. Obviously, Putin sees the position he's in and what's going on. If he doesn't, or if he has just been simply trying to push the West back to get concessions without fully committing to boots on the ground, and he doesn't, what kind of a position or face-saving position does that put the Biden administration in for having more, so aggressively said all along that this is coming, this is going to happen? It's like you've said, Claire. How's the Biden administration going to walk this back? And why didn't Putin do something like this with a Donald Trump as president? And what kind of relationship?
Yeah, Putin took the measure of Trump. He wasn't going to pull anything like this with Trump. How is Biden going to, emerge from this? Well, if Putin does not invade any further into Ukraine, Biden will say, we claim a victory. We deterred him. We were strong. We stood fast. We prevented the war. We stood up to Putin. No such thing as in the eyes of Putin. He sees Biden for what he is, weak and ineffectual. But that's what the Biden administration, the handlers, I should say, that's what the teleprompter will say. We stood up to Putin and we deterred him. That's what they'll say.
After this is all said and done, what kind of a lasting effect, both in the United States and Russia, but also NATO, Europe, the world in general, what kind of a lasting effect is this going to have? What do you see rippling out of this?
I read a column by, it was David Goldman, the very astute editor or co-editor, I guess, maybe at the Asia Times, writing in the person, his persona of Spengler, just a week or 10 days or so ago. And, he sets up this scenario where in the past he used to talk to a Ouija board back and forth. Well, this time he was in the cellar or the sewers of Paris, and he was talking to the ghost of Cardinal Richelieu. So this is how he sets it up. But the way it went was that Richelieu was telling David that actually Putin may have done a favor for NATO. And this is to answer your question, Tony, and that is that what Putin has done is not only, as I said before, expose the fissures and the weakness within NATO, but kind of slapped it upside the head, that maybe they'll come to their senses and realize, we don't have to expand any further east. Ukraine does not need to be, ought not to be a member of NATO, but rather remain as a buffer state, neither
Oh,
Warsaw Pact nor NATO. And that NATO really needs to be sure that it can defend what it has already bitten off, which it cannot do right now. NATO has no chance of standing against Russia, not just in Ukraine, but in NATO proper itself. They have no chance of standing up to the military that Putin has amassed. Now, yeah, when the body bags start coming home, that won't be so good. The economy of Russia would take a serious hit. Diplomatically, a full-on invasion would break off, would obviate any further possibility of negotiations or discussions or the exertion of leverage against NATO, US, and Europe. All those things are true, but the benefit that Richelieu was offering to David Goldman in this piece is that maybe this will get NATO to come to its senses and realize, number one, it is alone. The United States is not coming the cavalry over the hill. They're not. We're not. But number two, that they are going to have to, in this case, build up their own defenses, their own militaries, to a point of credibility, which they are not now. That was the point of this essay of David's, and I think it makes sense.
mm. Good point. Good point. Colonel, your take on that? Comments?
Just as I also said, it does make sense. I think Putin has indirectly strengthened NATO. And I hadn't read the article, but I'm glad somebody else agrees. But I think he's indirectly strengthened NATO. It might be a calculated risk for him. Look, I tell a story sometimes for the students here that I talked to in the Chicago area. I said, when Caesar had won in Gaul, he had come back to a victorious parade. He stood on a hill, looked down on the Senate, and said that this nation, this Senate, this republic will not last. He knew the character of the people at that time because now they had defeated everybody. So what does he do? He crosses the Rubicon. He dies in the process. Civil wars erupt, by Rome expands in that process. And I think this is that type of a Rubicon moment. I think that with the U.S. really being weak under the leadership in 2018,
You're
which
breaking up a little bit.
was under the Obama leadership, which is the same leadership, the same people that were advising President Obama are advising currently President Biden. When I wrote an article on the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement in 2015, published it in October that year after I had talked about the Chinese influence to the Japanese in February of that year. It was about power relations, and where Wang Yi stood at the Brookings Institute and said that this is Chinese Communist Party vision for the globe. Of course, Russia was not in that vision. And instead of the United States and Susan Rice and Obama countering it, Susan Rice actually went to George Washington and talked about how to actualize it. So I think he understands, Putin in this case, that I was left out then, and it's the same cast of characters now. Unfortunately, U.S. is weak. It cannot even handle some of its domestic issues, let alone securing his own borders to be able to do anything in Europe. And I think indirectly, he has taken the calculations till now that worked for him and his advantage, not just to be able to split Europe, make sure that they're tied to him, expand his footprint in the Middle East, be that kind of a power broker that he can play China and the Shanghai Corporation organizations as needed for his advantage. But I think at the same time, if he plays his cards right, it may put him in a position where he's going to be much more um, seen as a viable leader, not just politically, but also his push as far as strengthening the Russian church and having the Russian church strike communion with other churches of the Near East and the Middle East and in the Near East region to be able to expand his power base as the United States is slowly starting to retreat, not just from Afghanistan, looking at even Iraq now that's pretty much on the Iranian influence. Even I just came back in October out of the Horn of Africa, Near East, where we're looking at how we can help the East Africa nations. And if we start losing our footprint there, I think you could be assured that he understands that the U.S. under the leadership and the current political bosses may not be a nation that can really take the lead. And I think eventually, if let's say NATO comes out stronger after this so-called political and even maybe military fight, you're gonna see them give credit more to the steps Putin took rather than the United States. Unfortunately, we are reactive to what the international players are doing now, more than actually going out there with a strong, cohesive foreign policy that could translate from leader to leader, executive to executive, in order for us to be able to have a long, enduring presence on the global stage. Look, even our military structures and how we have built our force structures capacities with the multi-industrial complex could be questioned now as to whether or not that's the future of a fight. Um, I mean, we
Hmm.
keep on saying that, Putin with cyber can do much more damage than we could do with our platforms. We learned these lessons when I was in Iraq, as I was taking
Absolutely.
lessons and we were training the SWAT and various different militaries and who were coming to Thailand for participating in the Ramus Challenge Asiana, where one simple drone with a 2 or 3 round tied to it at $60 a pop killed a number of ISF, Iraqi Special Forces, and it was being used by the terrorists on the ground who were remotely controlling it. So, especially in the fight for Mosul. So, the battle space has changed. However, the way we award multi contracts to these big platforms that sometimes do not achieve the mission we want them to achieve, he may have made a calculation that we are very much behind when it comes to developing our military to fight future wars, especially if the fact that you're going to spend more time teaching about equity and social justice to the military rather than looking at what the future wars are going to look like a decade, 40 years from now, and how we need to be able to, fight those type of wars. We may be behind on this one. I hope we're not, but it seems like we are.
I think I would have to agree on that point. I just don't see conventional wars dominating in the future. And you mentioned Africa, and we've talked about this before. That China is in Africa. Um, Russia's as you pointed out, is trying to make footholds there too. Where's China in all this? How is China just sitting back, watching? Um, and when all the dirt settles after all of this, where is China going to be? And what kind of lessons do you think that they're taking out of this, or observations, or intelligence, whatever, that they're gleaning from this?
Well, China is never going to be able to sit back and relax. It can't. It's hard to feed 3 billion people or billions of people, I should say, 3 meals a day. So you have to constantly expand. The Chinese Communist Party, of course, is different than what we talk about when we talk about China itself. Look, just a day ago, Even France is now leaving Mali. Who entered Mali? The Wagner Group. Who does the Wagner Group for Russia? China is everywhere. China is in this fight also. But China doesn't put their people on the ground. What they do, they work through their conglomerates and they work through individuals like Putin, who is part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and others. So if Putin goes into Ukraine, guess what? China's in Ukraine. If Putin goes into Syria, China's in Syria. If Iran is operating with Hezbollah in Lebanon, China is there. So China's always there. It's just there with money, and it is there with support when it comes to the Security Council. So if we try to do anything against Russia, and Russia has a veto power in the Security Council, China will support them at the same time. So we have put ourselves in a position where the structures are out there to support us or squeezing us. Look, if it was about the issue of the um, uh, really, when you're looking at it, it was the issue of what China was trying to do, uh, getting in with the 5G networks, specifically into Europe and its conglomerates. When we first initially struck the deal with Iran, where Iran actually brought us to the nuclear discussion table, as is sat across all the major member nations that are currently, most of them in the NATO, and struck that deal. It was an economic deal. It divided the United States and the European companies to fight against each other to see who would first get a foothold in Iran's economy as it expanded. Today, the fight that is taking place again with Iran forcing the hands of the Western nations and NATO nations to again try to negotiate on a deal. It's still China is behind it. So everywhere Iran is, China is. Everywhere Russia is, China is. Everywhere there's a fight that needs to be achieved on the economic side to pressure EU, China's there. So China is expanding itself, but is using others to do so.
Claire?
Yeah, I would put a little bit of a different spin on this. Excuse me. Russia's population, as we know, is in a demographic death spiral. Putin
Mm-hmm.
knows this as well as anybody else. Their birth rate is somewhere in the range of, I don't know, about 1.56 children per woman per lifetime. Not the
And I
same.
think I think the ratio between men and women is still like something like 4 or 5 to 1
In Russia? No, not in
in
Russia.
Russia.
No, not quite that bad, but their average life expectancy, in particular for men, it goes downwards, not up. So Russia's population is in a demographic death spiral. What that means is that Russia not only cannot afford to lose tens and tens of thousands of troops in a war in in Ukraine. In the very near future, it will not be able to hold on to Siberia either. Siberia is rich in oil and gas and minerals and other resources. China's population also is going off a cliff. They currently claim, at least, to have 1.4 billion people in China. They probably have quite a few fewer than that. But nevertheless, because of the one-child policy for so many years, the infanticide and abortion of female babies, there currently are somewhere in the range of 20 or 30 or maybe even 40 million men in China who will never find a wife. As an aside, that is what is causing a horrific human trafficking problem in and around
Mm-hmm.
China's periphery. But that said, China eyes Siberia and its resources not because it's going to need Lebensraum or space for its population, which is precipitously declining, but because it doesn't have those resources itself. It doesn't have. I mean, you would think a country that big would have natural resources like those, but they don't. And so China is looking covetously at Siberia, which Russia will not be able to hold on to. But neither will China, whose demographic death spiral is a little bit behind that of Russia by decades, some number of decades. China's not going to have a very anywhere near the population that it has right now in coming decades by the end of this century, let's say, either. As a matter of fact, the projections are that the United States population will outnumber that of China by the end of this 21st century. That's very probable. So China and Russia both see a closing window of opportunity. They see weakness in the West, weakness in particular in the White House right now. And each of them is trying to grab whatever they can in this window of time that they see closing. Certainly, some closure will be coming with the midterm elections in the United States, congressional elections to be held in November of this year, 2022. So each of them wants to grab what they can. Now, Russia traditionally, historically, culturally, religiously, linguistically, ethnically, is far more looking to the West than it is to the East. We make a humongous blunder if we shove Russia off into the arms of China, which wants to gobble up especially, or at least Siberia. So yes, at the moment there is an opportunistic sort of an entente, if you will, between Moscow and Beijing, but that's not out of any lost love for each other. It is out of opportunistic thinking at the moment, but
self-interest.
Russia needs to look west, and we need to impress upon Russia that it needs to look west, so that we can both stand up against the belligerence of China, which isn't going to land invade anybody except its own, as they would see it, wayward province of Taiwan, but wants to tie, as Sargis was saying, wants to tie the rest of the world to it by linkages of economic and technological dependence and obligation in the way of emperors of old paying tribute to the Middle Kingdom. That's what China wants to do. Russia doesn't want to be part of that. We need to impress that upon Russia.
It seems to me, you're almost saying that looking at the Russia and China wanting to grab what they can, that they're almost, or certainly China is, it seems like, they've almost like decided that the U.S. could be kind of put on the sidelines.
Well, for the moment, we are on the sidelines with, the current air quotes, big air quotes, leadership in Washington, D.C., be it the White House, be it our senior current officials at State Department, at Defense Department, at the National Security Council. I mean, look what we have. We've got an Antony Blinken at the State Department who got, completely slapped around by the Chinese up in Anchorage, Alaska, not so long ago, and by his side, the absolutely hapless, well, of course, Ivy League educated, that says it all. Hapless National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who had not a word to say against the Chinese up in Anchorage there. They look at these people, powerful leaders like Xi Jinping, like Vladimir Putin, and they look at what we're putting up for our leadership, focused on white supremacy and racial inequality and whatever else our military is doing these days, never mind our top schools and academia, and they laugh at the opportunity for themselves.
Colonel? How do you beat that, right? Colonel, we lost you?
you have to look at it. Everything that Claire says is on point. I mean, look, my son's high school recently, five young students protested against a mask mandate in high school. Had three police vehicles out there for five individuals. And then, of course, after they were done, the principal came out without any evidence or any information or recordings that they used racial slurs and, tried to get the rest of the high schoolers to go out and do a protest against those individuals, which I don't believe, from what I was told by my son, that that protest really manifests. But if you look at it, you have high schoolers that are walking out on these mask mandate issues, and the college students are putting double masks and actually just marching to goose step to the tunes of what the dictatorship has told them. It is going to take a generation, and these younger kids that are coming up who are no longer going to put up with what is happening, what is taking place, and how our so-called college students, best and brightest, are just goose stepping to make a change. Now, U.S., we're talking about almost 20 years that would take, where we could maybe have a new brand
Carl,
of leaders
you've got a problem with
that are going to be our counter it.
your signal's fading in and out.
Is this better, Tony?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. So look, yeah, it's going to take some generations for us to reset ourselves internally, but you can't blame these individuals for taking the steps that they're taking, like Putin. So look, if you want on the face, as the United States, you could sit with Putin behind closed doors if you had the opportunity and say to him that, look, you and I need each other, United States and Russia, if you're going to counter China, who's your main enemy in the long run anyway. As Claire stated, how they're eyeing everything on the east of Russia, China is. And frankly, if you go to east of Russia, most of the provinces at the local levels, you have a Chinaman who speaks Mandarin Chinese and Russian, who's actually representing those so-called Russians to the Russian government in Moscow. So the demographically, they're already in there anyway, and trying to take over those territories. The one thing you could tell Putin is we need each other. We got to work together. Yes, on the face of things, I have to stand with Ukraine, but Ukraine can be that bridge that could be a tie for us, both East and the West. It could be that one country that we could use, just like we use Taiwan between China and the United States. And in the long run, depending on how it develops, it's probably going to be more natural for the people of Ukraine, as much as they're going to be more wanting to be like the West, much more geographically and culturally tied to Russia. It could be a bastion of where we could actually strengthen the ability of the East and the West coming together in unity to strengthen themselves against the menace of the Chinese Communist Party that is actually burning the entire, global landscape wherever it goes and touches. So you can have that discussion with him. Has that happened? I don't know. I don't believe so. Unfortunately, I think that everybody just has put themselves in a corner. They're talking past each other. We keep on saying NATO, and Putin doesn't even mention NATO. He says Ukraine. So speak his language if you truly want to address the issue he has, instead of just spinning out your talking points. Ukraine itself, also the leadership in the Ukraine, needs to stand up and make the statements, not waiting for the U.S. to make it on their behalf, and say, look, we have a lot of things we have to do to be that bridge, and let its people know that we can be in both worlds. We could beat both in the world of where Russia is, and because geographically we're close to them, be a powerful partner for them. But at the same time, that doesn't mean you cannot live your life like in prosperity, as we have seen the development of the GDP exploding of Ukraine itself. And once you're in a position where you're strong enough and both Russia and NATO are depending on you, then you can make the decision which way you want to go. I think if that mention is ever made by the leadership of Ukraine, that we are gonna reserve our decision as to where we want to be, and maybe if we're independent, it's gonna serve us best. I think you may see an end to this type of a conflict. But until that happens, I think unfortunately you're going to see Ukrainians or Russians dying on a battlefield of the Donbass, and the U.S. fecklessly trying to do something with sanctions, which are not going to have possibly the effects that we think they're going to have against Russia.
I agree. I mean, there's even controversy over whether it's deploying SWIFT sanctions would even do anything. That's a whole different story. I agree with you both wholeheartedly on this. Is that just sit down and talk with the man, because Russia, Putin, his administration, the United States, we share a common enemy, which is China. As Claire, as you both said, there's no love lost between Russia and China certainly isn't there to help Russia except for its own self-interest. Why doesn't, well, it's simply just back up. It seems to me over the decades that the party in power right now has always seemed to have a more hawkish, let's go fight dirty communist Russians, Soviets, and get into a war. Am I wrong in thinking that, aside from the fact that we could just sit down with the man and because we both have a common enemy that isn't to the benefit of either country?
Well, Tony, think about this. From 2015 to the current time, the mantra of the Democrat Party is Russia, 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 boogeyman, boogeyman, boogeyman. Now,
Exactly.
with Biden in the White House, formerly as vice president in the Obama years, and with Hillary Clinton and the presidential campaigns of 2016 and 2020 now in the rearview mirror. But the whole thrust of the Democrat Party was paint Russia as the 6-foot-tall boogeyman, and Donald Trump is in bed with them. They can't go back on that now. What are they going to say? Oh, well, maybe not. They can't go backwards. You see, they've painted themselves into a box canyon, and they can't get out of it. So they have to push for war with Russia to prove their street creds or doing push-ups or something that Biden would like to do. They've already set this scene for themselves, and they don't know how to get out of it, except by beating the drums of war and trying to get us into a war with Russia.
Thank you. I mean, that's what it seems to me to be. It just seems to me that this party has always historically, let's go kill Soviets or Russians, whatever. Let's get into a war. I just don't see that as the case now, as you just pointed out. Colonel, I think we'll just kind of leave it at this point. I think we've covered everything pretty well, but I'll throw that one back at you for a follow-up.
No, look, I agree 100% with Claire. I mean, I think if the current party leadership was making money with the Russian oligarchs, they'd be much more friendly into them. Unfortunately, they're making their money with the Chinese Communist Party leadership. So, money talks, as they say in Washington, D.C. So it is what it is. It's unfortunate where we're heading. I hope it doesn't happen. Take a note from the previous POTUS. I know a lot of people criticized his leadership, didn't like him, because sometimes he didn't understand how the system worked. But he was the one who actually forced NATO to, arm up, pay their costs, get ready for this fight. And he was very much strong against Putin, but he had a good relationship with him. Because when you can be strong internally and you're strong yourself, you can have that type of a relationship even with your adversary, because then your adversary knows that this relationship is based in mutual respect. But I do know that if I push my adversary, he will launch at me in a heartbeat. And in this case, unfortunately, you have the bureaucrats running the show on this one. It looks great on paper. They're going to write books about how they handled the whole issue of what was happening, and they will justify why we never supported Ukraine. But try to explain that to the Ukrainians who are going to feel that in the long run, it was the U.S. that put the noose around their neck and did nothing as that noose started tightening. Eventually, I think Putin has made the calculation. Maybe right now, Ukraine's gonna say that NATO and U.S. is our allies, but the second he goes in and they're not doing anything about it except for sanctions, those Ukrainians who are dying on the battlefield, their young men and women, their children are gonna turn around and say, you know what? U.S. didn't do anything, because every time we turned around, we didn't see any of them. All we heard was what they were trying to do through the economic process against Russia. So guess what? They're going to be closer to Russia anyway, regardless of what we were trying to do. I think Putin has figured that out. He understands the human nature. Unfortunately, we don't.
Well, that's a disconcerting point. Yeah. If that was to go that way, that would have just be another ember in the fire of the problems going on in the region, the discontent, I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but destabilizing component just thrown into the mix of all of this. If that was to happen, Ukraine was to feel that way. Just helps to destabilize the whole region even further, would it not?
Yeah, of course. I mean, Russia is the biggest nation out there, affecting the European continent, and Ukraine is the second largest European nation. These are juggernauts. They will have generational implications. I don't think our bureaucrats today understand that.
I don't think they can actually even read a map sometimes. Claire, I think we've covered everything, but if you want to bounce back with something on that point.
No, I'll just say that I thank you, Tony, for setting this up, and always good to be with you, Sarge, as well. And I just, I hope that our leadership can somehow learn some lessons from this. That weakness always, always, always invites aggression. But stand up to the bully. That is Putin. That is a key KGB thug. Stand up to him. You gain respect. You might not turn out to be best buds, but you will gain respect, and there will be stability. When there is weakness, there is chaos, and that's what we're looking at now.
Absolutely right. Claire, Colonel, thank you so much for being back on again. And as developments occur, we'll be back. Everyone, thanks for joining in. Another episode of Homeland Security Off the Record. We will be back with whatever is happening in the world again that's facing homeland and national security for the United States. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.